Some of you liked my last book wrap-up type of video, so here's another one, because I'm a slave to the algorithm. Please like and subscribe. This will consist of books I've read over the past few months, starting right away with Bag of Bones by Stephen King. In the end, I did like it, but it was a bit of a slog in some parts, and it was very clearly an earlier work of his. I'm a huge fan of his stuff, so I can kinda tell. I liked the characters, the plot was whatever, it felt like the usual King woke up from a fever dream and thought it was actually an aha moment. And I mean, I liked it overall, so I guess it sort of was an aha moment. It did have its fair share of bigotry, because at that point in his career, King had learned that liking women as sex objects doesn't exactly translate to feminism. I would recommend reading it if you like King, but again, it was obviously one of his earlier writings, and it had an amateur feel to it, so if you aren't a King fan that wants to read most of his work, there are better books of his to get started with. It was sort of wondering, and at times the thread was pretty lost, and again it has some of his more negative hallmarks in it. But I love his writing style, especially his earlier writing style, so I ate it up anyways. A book, however, that I did not like, well, it's complicated, was Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. I have heard it's an acquired taste, and it most certainly is. It was extremely slow-paced, excruciatingly boring for most of the time, and the characters were all incredibly unlikable, either because they were stupidly optimistic or because they just hated everyone in a way that wasn't very Yas Queen Girl Boss, and was more annoying. Please stop. Whenever it started getting interested and immediately tanked itself and went back to discussing the fundamentals of engineering. My father's an engineer, so I got my fill of that in childhood. Thank you very much, Miss Rand. Somehow I made it halfway through the book, which sounds menial, but it's over 1,000 pages, so I consider that pretty good ground covered. I may have made it through the entire thing if the writing style were not also actively acting against me finishing it. I had the full intent to see that thing through till the end, in hopes that it would get better, or at least I would enjoy the experience of listening to it and laughing at parts I didn't like, even if some of it wasn't very enjoyable. I'm of the mind that I prefer to finish books I don't even like, because the experience of thinking about it often leads me to think something new about the world that I live in, or about myself, so I can still gain something from the experience, even if I didn't like the book. But the writing was just so dense, past the point of purple prose and into the territory of so much sensory input happening that my brain would just shut off as a method to preserve itself. And it takes a lot for me to disengage due to dense writing. I quite like purple prose. I actively try to imitate it in my own writing. So you know that this stuff was serious business. The only character I really found interesting was Henry Reardon, because I too am disgustingly pessimistic and also an evil businessman who everyone hates. That sounded sarcastic, but I actually did like him. He was entertaining and interesting and kind of relatable because I wasn't kidding. I am an awful person. But my main gripe with this book is that I simply don't get the title. Maybe you can understand why I was so displeased with the contents when I finally read it if I tell you that I always for some reason thought that Atlas Shrugged was about Greek mythology and like followed the titular Atlas and was sort of a Song of Achilles deal. So when I started listening to it finally after years of awaiting this American classic story about Atlas, I was very confused. Then I was sort of into it because, like any other autistic, I can enjoy a good train or two, and then my brain turned to mush because of the minutia of Ayn Rand's writing style, and I fled the scene before I fully converted into a zombie with soup for brains. This sounds particularly scathing, I think. I did sort of enjoy some parts of it, but just overwhelmingly it was mind-numbing. Another book in which the writing style verged on zombifying me was Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. I've always had this morbid curiosity about what it was like to read this book. I knew what it was about, and I wasn't disappointed on that front. I mean, I was disappointed, but the book was exactly what I expected, and I was more so disappointed in Herbert the Pervert for obvious reasons. I found the premise interesting, the story was engaging, if only because it was so disgusting to think about, and it had shock value that kept you going. This book genuinely made me uncomfortable, and that's a very rare occurrence, so I offer it a round of applause for that. However, the writing was very dense and frankly kind of hard to follow at many times. I don't know if it was on purpose to mimic a sick man's brain, or if that's just our boy Vladimir being pretentious, but it made me feel how it made me feel either way. I didn't end up finishing this book either, which, unlike I've discussed before about certain books, I do sort of regret. If I can get my hands on the audiobook again, again because I had to wait months for it for the first time around because there were so many holds on it at my library, I will definitely pick up where I left off, which was about 75% of the way through it. Eventually, I did want to know how the story ended up and just how it would go, because at the point I got cut off, everything was just starting to go very, very wrong. I also do like that this book exists because it is, again, very uncomfortable. It's important to discuss and reflect on how pedophiles and other harmful types think and the reasons they do the things they do, because it can lead to treatment and prevention of these maladaptations forming and so on. I really don't agree with people who prefer to not think about these things, because if no one does, then they will only continue. And in this case, children will only continue to be hurt and traumatized for the rest of their lives, if not killed. We can only solve problems by talking about them, and novels are an especially effective way of talking about something, especially when you write unashamedly from the culprit's perspective, as is the case with Lolita. It's neither glorifying, and there is even some of the typical narcissistic self-doubt within Herbert's character. It doesn't hold anything back in the interest of taste or comfort, and it's pieces of extrospection like this that are what people need to consume, because again, problems never get solved without us first understanding them, and many people are just too unkeen on understanding things. And I could talk about that for a long time, but I'll stop there. I also listened to another Stephen King, his new novel Later. It was pretty enjoyable. I love the voice of the main character, so even when the story itself was slow or boring, I liked the experience of listening to the MC talk about the story. It was pretty short and sweet, so I don't have much to say. I liked it, and it had a very homey vibe. Give it a go. Perhaps unexpected with our current lineup, I also listened to The Art of War by Sun Qiao. It had a historical context and footnotes after the actual writings in the particular edition that I listened to, which I enjoyed listening to, and it gave a lot of important context and facts that I didn't previously have, which I think contributed to me enjoying the writing. I did read it just because it's a classic of philosophy, and I tend to end up enjoying those. And I did. Another short and sweet entry. More of the non-fiction. I was on a kick for a while there. I read The Personality Brokers by Merv Emery. It was very interesting. I'm studying to be a psychologist and potentially to do work in the field of social psychology, so I like learning about the history of it. I've never liked Myers-Briggs, and I always knew it was a scam made up by some dedicated eugenicists, but it was nice to hear it discussed in depth and to find out the truth about it in full. The book itself was pretty impartial and gave its opinion in a section all of its own so that it did not infect the rest of the writing, at least to the degree that the author could manage, because of course our opinions are always going to affect our writing. If you like psychology and want to know about the history of one of the most popular tests within it and why it sucks, I recommend checking it out. The writing was pretty engaging for a nonfiction book also, so it shouldn't lose you too often. And I mention that a lot when talking about nonfiction because for me it's a pretty important factor in whether I'm going to continue listening to it or reading it, just because I need something to keep me there. This has been far too positive for the last few minutes, so let's talk about a book I simply loathe due to how boring it is. Though again, the experience of reading it wasn't so bad. Where Atlas Shrugged had at least things that happened and actual characters, A Separation by Katie Kitamura did not have either of those things. It was also deeply dissatisfactory. I read it because the plot sounded very interesting, and I still think that a better author with more creativity could do something groundbreaking with such a concept that would say a lot about the things that it touches on. However, Kitamura's characters were all flat. The plot was failed by the writing, the main conflict was immediately revealed and resolved in a very boring way, although it's not exactly a conflict you could resolve, and I cannot stress enough that nothing happened. Not a single thing. Not one of note, at least. You could argue that a lot of things happened, but when you go to work in the morning, that's not exactly an interesting event in your day, you know? It was so uninteresting in every way possible, and that's coming from someone who usually eats stuff like this up. I love character studies, I love wandering stream of consciousness, I think it's interesting to see into the mind of somebody else, but apparently not this brick of a main character that we got in A Separation. There were maybe 2 or 3 events total in the entire book, and they were stretched out over the whole thing. Just the worst experience. All I have to say that's positive about it is that some of the characters were funny and I chuckled, but I can't say for sure whether it was intended. I would honestly prefer to read about some of the side characters rather than the main character. Again, I'm really disappointed to rip it apart so bad because there's serious potential in the plot, and I think it could could have been a really beautiful look into relationships and grief and how love changes and grows and dies. But it was just a slog that somehow I managed to finish. And again, I'll say that I enjoyed the experience of reading it, even if it was boring. Whenever something did happen, I often chuckled to myself about it or thought something about it that made me chuckle. I often find it hard to say that I didn't like a book because I often do enjoy the experience of consuming the book, and I just don't know how to pick it apart and explain it to somebody else in a accurate way that represents how I ended up feeling in the end. Another nonfiction book I read was Ted Bundy, Conversations with a Killer by Stephen G. Michaud. It's just a collection, more or less, of Ted Bundy's confession tapes, so I can't really critique writing or anything here. I can just say that, wow, Ted Bundy was insufferable, and I definitely see why he's the face of narcissism. It was kind of hard to listen to the entire thing just because Bundy was so painfully annoying as a person. I cannot imagine this man being charming, but maybe the facade just went away in prison. Understandable. You're kind of at the end of the road there. There's not really anywhere else to go but down. At least for me, I don't have a strong reaction like this whenever I'm faced with things like confession tapes or interview footage from police stations. I will think the person is stupid or that they are, how you say, dumb and perhaps a little callous, but never have I been so hit in the face by just how purely unpleasant a person was than when I listened to Ted Bundy's words. For me, that's saying quite a bit. Ending on that very positive note, I think that's quite a few books for one wrap-up. I did pull some older ones because I suddenly remembered what I'd like to say about them, so I hope you didn't mind that. But you don't know which ones they were, so that's fine. If you read any of these, let me know what you thought of them in the comments. And here's a fun game. If you don't like purple prose, try finishing Atlas Shrugged and let me know how that went for you. I would make up a drinking game for it, but any one that I made up would probably end up with you being killed or developing cancer in your liver. Is that possible? I don't know. Atlas Shrugged would make it possible. If you identify with Henry Reardon, leave a like. And if you would kick Bundy's ribs in on solely a personality basis, subscribe to my channel. I do these kinds of videos now and then, and I also talk about books sometimes.